he was just a mad beggar. Dirty, limping, forgotten by the world. But the woman who stepped out of her car that day, she saw something no one else did. What she didn't know was that the man lying in the dust used to own everything she now worked for. And in helping him, she unlocked a truth that would shake her world and change both their destinies forever. It began like any other hot afternoon in the city. Cars zoomed past impatiently, street vendors chased after customers, and people were too busy to notice much around them. But suddenly, the city seemed to pause. A crowd slowly formed beside a traffic-filled highway where an unusual sight captured everyone's attention. Among them were fruit sellers, mechanics in greasy overalls, uniformed students, and even stern-looking policemen, all frozen, watching a wealthy woman step out of her luxury car and approach a man who looked like he had nothing left in life. Some recorded on their phones. Others stared in silence. What happened next would become the story people talked about for months. But at that moment, they only saw a strange woman helping a man the world had already written off. He was more shadow than man, an invisible figure in a city that never slowed down. No one knew his name. No one asked. He had become part of the scenery, like the cracked pavement, the flickering streetlight, or the peeling posters on the wall behind him. Each morning, he would drag himself to the same corner by the roadside, settling near a rusted drainage pipe, surrounded by the smell of exhaust fumes and fried akara from nearby vendors. His clothes were no longer clothes, just layers of dirt-stained fabric barely clinging to his frail body. His beard grew wild, tangled like the thoughts he buried deep inside. His skin was tough and sunburnt, marked by countless days under the scorching sun and endless nights under heavy rain. Children often pointed at him and laughed, calling him names. Adults muttered that he must have been cursed, or perhaps he was just another drunk who wasted his life. No one ever stopped to see the quiet pain in his eyes, or the way he flinched every time a horn blared too close, as though haunted by invisible memories. He never begged loudly. He didn't chase after cars or shout at passers-by like the others. He just sat there, day after day, legs stretched awkwardly in front of him, one arm holding a cracked plastic cup that rarely had more than a few coins in it. His silence spoke louder than screams. Behind that silence was a storm. He had been a man with a name, a title, a purpose. He had once stood tall in suits tailored to his taste, had walked into boardrooms with confidence and pride. But all of that had been stripped from him, his identity, his reputation, his dignity, until he was reduced to nothing more than a forgotten soul tossed aside by a world too busy to care. The city moved on, but he remained, a quiet reminder of how quickly a life can fall apart. Ada Aura was the kind of woman who walked into a room and turned silence into attention. Graceful, composed, and powerful, she was known across the city as a symbol of success and strength. Her name was written on towering billboards, printed in business magazines, and whispered in boardrooms where decisions that shaped the future were made. But behind her polished smile was a woman who had tasted pain. She had built her empire brick by brick, deal by deal, sacrifice by sacrifice. A single mother by fate, not choice, Ada Aura had once known love that turned bitter, and friendships that ended with betrayal. She had been judged, underestimated, and challenged. Yet, she stood, taller than ever, draped in elegance, draped in stories she rarely told. Her days were filled with meetings, construction site inspections, fundraising galas, and strategy sessions. Her nights, though spent in a mansion with high ceilings and designer furniture, often echoed with silence. Success was hers, but peace was still a distant dream. On the day everything changed, Ada Aura wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that part of the city. Her driver had suggested an alternate route to avoid traffic, and she had absent-mindedly agreed, eyes fixed on her tablet as she scrolled through emails. The street they entered was crowded, noisy, chaotic, very unlike her usual, carefully managed environments. And then she saw him, a man on the roadside, slumped beside a cracked wall, his body caked in dirt and exhaustion. Something about him made her freeze, something deep and unsettling. It wasn't just pity. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition, not of his face, but of the pain buried beneath it. She knew that kind of emptiness. She had seen it before, in her own mirror, years ago, when her world had almost collapsed. As the car slowed to pass, her heart pulled. Her driver kept going, but she suddenly said, "Stop." The staff in the car exchanged confused glances, unsure why their boss would want to stop in such a place. But Aurora wasn't thinking like a CEO in that moment. She was thinking like a human being. There, amidst the noise of traffic and the eyes of strangers, a woman of wealth, class, and power did what many would never do. She stepped out of her comfort and into someone else's suffering. She didn't yet understand why. But fate was moving. And destiny was watching. The air felt thick with disbelief. As Aurora stepped out of her luxury car, the city around her seemed to pause. Horns that once blared fell silent. Conversations faded. Heads turned. No one could understand what a woman of her status was doing, walking toward a man who hadn't had a proper bath in weeks, whose presence most people avoided like a plague. She walked slowly but deliberately, her heels clicking against the uneven pavement, dust staining the hem of her gown. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup flawless, her jewelry sparkling under the afternoon sun. But she wasn't thinking about appearances. She wasn't thinking about who was watching. What she saw in that moment was not a beggar, not a stain on the sidewalk, not a nuisance to be pitied or ignored. She saw a man, a human being whose soul had been shattered, not by weakness, but by something the world never paused to ask about. The crowd began to grow, whispering and pointing. Some smirked, assuming she was just doing charity for the cameras. Others reached for their phones, already recording, waiting for a dramatic moment to go viral. But Aurora didn't notice any of it. Her eyes remained on the man before her, lying in a tangle of limbs, lost in silence. She knelt beside him, a gesture so simple, yet so shocking that murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman of wealth, lowering herself beside a man most wouldn't touch with a stick. Some gasped. Others shook their heads. A few turned away, embarrassed by the reflection her act cast on their own apathy. Her assistant rushed toward her, panicking, unsure whether she was acting out of impulse or compassion. Her security team hesitated, caught between protecting her image and obeying her command. Without a word, she signaled them to help. And they did. With caution and care, they lifted the man gently into the back seat of her vehicle. He didn't resist. He didn't even look up. His body was limp, like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with dignity. The car door shut, and just like that, they drove off. But the silence they left behind spoke louder than the engines. People remained frozen, still staring at the empty spot where a miracle had just taken place. What they had witnessed wasn't just charity. It was humanity, raw, unscripted, and rare. The mansion gates opened slowly, welcoming in someone the world had rejected. Inside the compound, marble floors sparkled under golden chandeliers, manicured lawns stretched like soft carpets, and a cool breeze whispered through the open corridors of Adeora's estate. For many, this was paradise. But for the man lying in the backseat, it was confusing, almost frightening. He didn't speak. He didn't protest. It was as though his mind had detached from the reality unfolding around him, his body present, but his spirit still trapped under that roadside bridge where he had been forgotten. Housekeepers froze in shock. Drivers exchanged nervous glances. No one dared to question Adeora's decision, but the unspoken tension was clear. Why had she brought him here? The man was carried to the guest house on the far end of the compound, a secluded wing, quiet and comfortable, with its own garden and view of the ocean. The space was filled with warmth, not just from its decor but from the intention behind it. Aurora had instructed that everything be done gently, respectfully. Doctors were called. Nurses attended. He was bathed, his wounds cleaned, his overgrown beard shaved. Beneath the dirt and matted hair emerged a face weathered by suffering but still holding remnants of quiet strength. The limp he had was puzzling. There were no visible injuries. The doctors concluded it was trauma-induced, psychological. A mind that had been broken could sometimes convince the body it was too. He refused to speak. He ate very little. He avoided mirrors, flinching at his own reflection like it was someone he no longer recognized. Sometimes he stared out the window for hours. Other times he curled into himself, silent and unreachable. Yet Aurora came to see him every day. She didn't speak much during those visits. She would sit in the armchair by the window, reading a book or just watching the sea, giving him space. Her presence wasn't demanding. It was patient. Over time, the silence between them softened. His eyes began to follow her movements. His breathing calmed when she entered. He started eating more, sleeping longer. Then one afternoon, something changed. He walked out to the garden barefoot, trembling, but standing on his own. He sat on a bench, under the sun, in the open, unafraid. He picked up a pen and slowly wrote something on the corner of an old newspaper left nearby. It was a name. His name. And just like that, the journey back to life had begun. The name he wrote that day was simple, 2 words. But to Aurora, it was a doorway into a past buried under pain and silence. Michaelese. It didn't take long for her team to begin digging. With her resources and connections, what would take months for an ordinary person took days. Files were pulled, court records reviewed, articles unearthed, and business profiles cross-checked. What they uncovered left Aurora in stunned silence. Michaelese wasn't just anyone. He was once one of the country's brightest tech minds, a visionary entrepreneur, founder of a billion-naira startup that revolutionized digital logistics. A man who had graced the covers of major business magazines, who had spoken at international conferences, and who had been considered a rising icon of the African tech space. But 3 years ago, everything crumbled. The official reports said he was arrested for financial mismanagement, fraud, embezzlement, and breach of trust. His arrest was swift, public, and merciless. Pictures of him in handcuffs splashed across headlines. Reporters labeled him a fraud, and society turned its back with cold finality. But the real story, what Adeora's team discovered, was far more devastating. Michael had been betrayed. His closest friend, his company's chief financial officer, the man he had mentored since university, had carefully orchestrated a setup. Using fake invoices, hidden offshore accounts, and political connections, the CFO funneled money out of the company while leaving a trail that pointed directly to Michael. When the storm hit, it hit hard. Shareholders panicked. The board ousted him. Police were called. His home was searched. His accounts frozen. He was arrested without warning. And just like that, the empire he built with sleepless nights and honest sweat came crashing down. Even worse, his wife, humiliated by the public disgrace, left the country with their only child. She didn't even come to court. By the time Michael was released due to insufficient evidence, his life was nothing but ashes. No money, no family, no voice to defend himself. He wandered, broken, silent, until he vanished into the streets, swallowed by a system that never looked back. As Aurora sat in her study, reading through the compiled reports, she felt a chill. She thought of the quiet man who now sat in her garden, alone, sipping tea like a ghost among the living. She understood pain. She had tasted betrayal too, but not like this. Not on this scale. And she made a decision. Michael's story wasn't going to end like this. Not under her watch. Not if she could help it. She wasn't just going to give him shelter. She was going to give him his life back. Once the truth was uncovered, Aurora didn't hesitate. She had seen enough injustice to know that silence often protects the guilty while crushing the innocent. But not this time. Not with this man. Not with Michael. With a renewed sense of purpose, she activated her network, lawyers, investigators, journalists, analysts, and friends in high places. What had been hidden in shadows for years began to unravel under the light of careful scrutiny. Documents were re-examined. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Files that had mysteriously disappeared were recovered. Slowly, the narrative shifted. Quietly, but powerfully. And while Aurora fought behind the scenes, she also worked to bring Michael back. Not just his name, but his confidence, his mind, his voice. She started by inviting him to sit in on small meetings, just listening. At first, Michael said little. He sat with his arms folded, his eyes distant, his body still tense like a man unsure whether he was dreaming or being set up for another fall. But soon, the old instincts began to stir. In one meeting, he scribbled a few notes on a legal pad. Those notes turned into ideas. Those ideas turned into suggestions. And those suggestions began solving problems Adeora's team had been struggling with for months. People started to notice. They were skeptical at first, unsure of this quiet man in plain shirts and modest shoes. But results are hard to ignore. One proposal saved a sinking development deal. Another uncovered a loophole in a land acquisition contract. Clients began asking for the man who sits by the window. Adeora said nothing. She let his work speak for him. Behind the scenes, the scandal that destroyed him began to collapse. The very man who framed him, his former CFO, was caught up in a web of his own lies. A warrant was issued. Assets were frozen. And the name Michael Ease reappeared in the news, not as a criminal, but as a man who had been wronged. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply walked into Adeora's office one morning, stood beside her desk, and for the first time since he arrived in her world, he smiled. It was faint, quiet, but it was the kind of smile that comes when a soul begins to breathe again. Michael had started to rebuild, not just his life, but himself. And Adeora watched with quiet pride. She had seen something in him that day on the street. Something no one else did. And now, the world was beginning to see it too. The transformation wasn't only happening on paper or in boardrooms. It was unfolding within Michael. Slowly, steadily, layers of shame, bitterness, and fear peeled away like old skin. He began to stand taller. Speak clearer. Laugh softly again. Not the loud laugh of a man who never suffered, but the quiet one of someone grateful for each breath. And Adeora, she noticed everything. She noticed the way he paused before entering rooms, as though remembering he belonged again. She noticed the way he helped her staff gently, always saying thank you like someone who had once known the coldness of being invisible. Most of all, she noticed how often she thought of him. She told herself it was gratitude, that she was just proud of the man he was becoming. But her heart knew the truth long before her mind would admit it. One evening, as the sun melted into a warm orange across her backyard, Adeora stood by the balcony watching Michael walk through the garden. He paused by the hibiscus tree, ran his fingers gently along its petals, and smiled at nothing in particular. She felt a sudden heaviness in her chest. Not of sadness, but of something deeper, something that scared her. Was she falling for him? How could she, after all she had been through, after building her life with iron and fire, refusing to let any man close enough to break her again? But Michael wasn't like the others. He had nothing to prove, and yet everything about him spoke volumes. He carried no pride, no false strength. Just truth, depth, and a kindness so rare, it disarmed her. That night, they ate dinner together, just the two of them. Candlelight flickered softly. The evening breeze whispered through the open windows. They didn't talk about business. They talked about books, about childhood, about pain, and healing. At one point, Michael grew silent. His eyes searched hers. Then he said, Adeora, I never said thank you. Not properly. You didn't just feed me or clothe me. You gave me back my dignity, my voice, my name. She looked at him, her eyes misting. Michael, you gave yourself all that. I just reminded you of who you were. In that quiet moment, the air between them shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was two broken hearts recognizing one another and beginning to hope again. They didn't touch. They didn't kiss. But something deeper passed between them that night. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. News spread like wildfire. Michael Ease, the former CEO once labeled a fraud and disgrace, was back. But this time, the headlines told a different story, exonerated. Betrayed CEO speaks out. The man who lost everything and rose again. His former company, now faltering under mismanagement and public distrust, scrambled to do damage control. But the truth had roots now, too deep to be uprooted by lies. Michael didn't seek revenge. He didn't return to destroy anyone. Instead, he stood before a packed press conference, clad in a simple grey suit, no flashy watch, no dramatic flair, and told his story with grace. He spoke not of bitterness, but of lessons. He didn't name names to ruin reputations. The investigations had already done that. His former CFO was already facing prosecution. The board members who had betrayed him were resigning one by one, under public pressure and legal scrutiny. Instead, Michael used the platform to speak about forgiveness, about resilience, about the dangers of judging a man by his lowest moment. People wept. Others applauded. Even those who once spat in his direction now looked at him with awe. But amidst the crowd, his eyes searched only for one face, Ada. She stood at the far end of the hall, her arms folded, pride shining in her eyes, tears quietly lining the edges. She didn't wave. She didn't smile broadly. But Michael saw it, the unspoken connection they now shared. A victory that belonged to them both. Later that evening, a group of former investors approached him. They wanted him back in the boardroom, back in the industry, back at the helm of the empire he built. But Michael surprised them. He declined. Not out of pride or pain, but clarity. He had outgrown the very walls that once defined him. The suits, the meetings, the glass offices. He had been remade, not to rebuild the same kingdom, but to create something new, something meaningful. Instead, he announced the launch of a new foundation, one dedicated to rehabilitating wrongly accused professionals, helping ex-prisoners regain dignity, and creating job opportunities for the homeless. It was bold. It was unexpected. But it was deeply Michael. And it was deeply inspired by one woman who had once stepped out of her SUV and knelt beside a man the world had forgotten. The man they once called a beggar. Now, they called him a legend. The sun was beginning to rise, soft orange hues bathing the city in a warmth that felt almost symbolic. Ada stood at her balcony, a mug of tea in hand, watching the world slowly wake up. Her heart, too, was awakening. Not just from grief or disappointment, but from years of self-protection. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. And not because of wealth or control, but because of what she and Michael had built together. A few weeks had passed since his press conference. The foundation was already changing lives. Formerly homeless men and women now walked the streets with purpose. Youths who once begged at street corners were now in training programs, learning skills they never dreamed they'd have access to. And Michael, he had moved in next door, not out of need, but choice. Their relationship had taken on a new rhythm. Not rushed, not forced, just present, gentle, real. One evening, as they walked through the same market where Ada had once met him, the sellers who used to ignore him now greeted him with respect. Some apologized. Some bowed in shame. But Michael only smiled and said, "Life happens. But grace is louder than judgment." A little boy ran up to him and asked, "Uncle, is it true you used to sleep on the street?" Michael knelt beside the child and nodded. Yes, but only for a while. God had a different plan. The boy's mother, holding a tray of fruits, watched in awe. That night, after dinner, Ada and Michael sat on the porch of her home. The stars above sparkled like witnesses to a divine promise fulfilled. Michael looked at her and said, "You didn't just save me. You saw me. And in doing so, you reminded me of who I am." Ada turned to him, her eyes soft. "And you reminded me of what love without fear looks like." They didn't need grand gestures. No rings. No parades. Just the quiet certainty of two souls who had fought their own battles and found healing in each other. The once lost CEO. The guarded businesswoman. Now partners in purpose, love, and legacy. And as they sat in that peaceful silence, one truth echoed in the air. Sometimes, the greatest rescue isn't from poverty or pain, but from being unseen. And in seeing each other, they found everything they had been missing.